Fascism, a form of radical authoritarian nationalism, characterized by dictatorial powers, forcible suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce, that came to prominence in the early 20th century Europe. Forcible suppression of the opposition. Of course, we don't have to deal with that in America today. We have freedom of speech. What they don't teach us in school is that governments are more complex than they used to be. Rather than rule by pure force, governments today utilize advancements in the fields of psychology. They understand the arguments made by Niccolo Machiavelli and Edward Bernays in his book Propaganda. They manipulate the masses to further political agendas. In order to get the masses to silence dissent against the government is tasked with the challenge of demonizing populations of the government which go against the government's current agenda. Historically, government officials convinced poor white people that minorities were a threat to them. This divide and conquer strategy allowed politicians to gain power and control over the direction of the country. Who does the government demonize today? Last week, a story broke that James Damore, a young Google employee, wrote a controversial memo on diversity. He used male and female work relations as an example to bolster his bigger point: the dangers of people believing their political ideology is ideologically superior to all others, and the assumption that beliefs that go against these superior political ideologies must be based on hatred and therefore should be suppressed. A national firestorm ensued, and James has since lost his job. Let's take a look into James' Google diversity memo and how it correlates with American society today as a whole. The author describes his own political views as classical liberalism and strongly value individualism and reason. Google's ideological echo chamber. How bias clouds our thinking about diversity and inclusion, by James Damore, July 2017. Psychological safety is built on mutual respect and acceptance, but unfortunately our culture of shaming and misrepresentation is disrespectful and unaccepting of anyone outside its echo chamber. Google's political bias has equated the freedom from offense with psychological safety, but shaming into silence is the antithesis of psychological safety. This silence has created an ideological echo chamber where some ideas are too sacred to be honestly discussed. The lack of discussion fosters the most extreme and authoritarian elements of this ideology. Definitions, extreme. All disparities in representation are due to oppression. Authoritarian. We should discriminate to correct for this oppression. It is important to understand that 6 corporations control 90% of the mainstream media. The public is given an illusion of choice, when in reality, the mainstream media is a conglomerate of corporate government propaganda. I use the word propaganda because to understand the American government, we must first come to the understanding that the same people who control 90% of the media buy off the politicians and have secret meetings at conferences such as Bilderberg. The media attends these conferences, but until recently, would not even acknowledge that they existed. These corporate government leaders, ABC, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, Comedy Central, ESPN, generally all push the same messaging. We are constantly bombarded with government propaganda. Ask yourself, how in line is your belief system with what you see regularly being pushed by this conglomerate of corporate government propaganda and control? And of course, this corporate government extends past traditional media. Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter have essentially become the internet. They have immense power over information. A recent FOIA request shows that the CIA, our unelected leaders, also known as the Deep State, have tremendous influence over Hollywood. What messaging have these institutions been pushing on you your entire life? Do you think they are operating to make social justice? Or do you think they are running a similar divide and conquer strategy that was ran in the past when whites were bombarded with endless propaganda about the minorities being dangerous? Background. People generally have good intentions, but we all have biases which are invisible to us. Thankfully, open and honest discussion with those who disagree can highlight our blind spots and help us grow, which is why I wrote this document. Google has several biases, and honest discussion about these biases is being silenced by the dominant ideology. What follows is by no means the complete story, but it's a perspective that desperately needs to be told at Google. Google's bias. At Google, we talk so much about unconscious bias as it applies to race and gender, but we rarely discuss our moral biases. Political orientation is actually a result of deep moral preferences and thus biases. Considering that the overwhelming majority of the social sciences, media, and Google lean left, we should critically examine these prejudices. And then he made a chart of what he perceives to be left biases and right biases. Left bias, compassion for the weak, disparities are due to injustice, and humans are inherently cooperative. Right biases, respect for strength and authority, disparities are natural and just, humans are inherently competitive. Only facts and reason can shed light on these biases, but when it comes to diversity and inclusion, Google's left bias has created a politically correct monoculture that maintains its hold by shaming dissenters into silence. This silence removes any checks against encroaching extremist and authoritarian policies. For the rest of this document, I'll concentrate on the extreme stance that all differences in outcome are due to differential treatment and the authoritarian element that's required to actually discriminate to create equal representation. As stated earlier, almost everything that is mainstream media, social networks, and Hollywood is controlled by what we could call the political left, or progressives. Of course, the message of this video can be lost by using such words. The political establishment is constantly changing definitions of words to confuse the public and change history. It can be argued that the political establishment has hijacked quote-unquote progressivism to promote regressive ideology. Progressivism is the support for the advocacy of social reform. As a philosophy, it is based on the idea of progress, which asserts that advancements in science, technology, economic development, and social organization are vital to the improvement of the human condition. Regressive, regressing or tendency to regress. Retrogressive, biology of, relating to, or affecting regression. Logic, obtained from or characterized by backward reasoning. YouTube, which is owned by Google, just put the ADL in charge of determining what constitutes controversial content. You know, the same ADL that declared Pepe the Frog racist. YouTube demonetizes and limits the reach of such controversial content. We have already seen prominent YouTube creators like Mark Dice and Paul Joseph Watson demonetized. Perhaps even scarier, people who aren't controversial, like Dave Rubin, who simply speak truth, have also been demonetized on YouTube. They even demonetized PewDiePie for a short while. Twitter has been caught censoring the Drudge Report, which simply reports news in a very non-controversial way. The social networking giant now censors any content that they deem sensitive. Twitter has permanently banned some conservatives and libertarians, including openly gay conservative Milo Yiannopoulos. They now provide the option and promote people censoring words and hashtags that they might find offensive. Facebook has suspended Michael Savage for reporting accurate crime statistics. They suspended Lauren Southern simply for defending Donald Trump's immigration policies. And they suspended Mark Dice for having the wrong opinion on transgenders. Fascism, a form of radical authoritarian nationalism, characterized by dictatorial powers, forcible suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce, that came to prominence in the early 20th century Europe. Dictatorial powers, suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce. Fascism. Now, let's take a look at the arguments the Google Diversity Memo made regarding women in the workplace and the perceived differences in wage gap between men and women. Non-biased causes of the gender gap in tech. On average, men and women biologically differ in many ways. These differences aren't just socially constructed because they're universal across human cultures. They often have clear biological causes and links to prenatal testosterone. Biological males that were castrated at birth and raised as females often still identify and act like males. The underlying traits are highly heritable. They're exactly what we would predict from an evolutionary psychological perspective. Note, I'm not saying that all men differ from all women in the following ways, or that these differences are just. I'm simply stating that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation of women in the tech and leadership. Many of these differences are small, and there's significant overlap between men and women, so you can't say anything about an individual given these population level distributions. He included this chart of population overlap to show that although men and women have different traits, and that doesn't mean these traits are bad or good, it is very dangerous to group people together as this is what men are and this is what women are, and that he does not endorse that.
My poor little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Personality differences. Women on average have more. Openness directed toward feelings and aesthetics rather than ideas. Women generally have a stronger interest in people rather than things relative to men, also interpreted as emphasizing versus systemizing. These two differences in part explain why women relatively prefer jobs in social or aesthetic areas. More men may like coding because it requires systemizing, and even within SWEs, comparatively more women work on front end, which deals with both people and aesthetics. Note that contrary to what a social constructionist would argue, research suggests that greater nation-level gender equity leads to psychological dissimilarity in men and women's personality traits, because as society becomes more prosperous and more egalitarian, innate dispositional differences between men and women have more space to develop, and the gap that exists between men and women in their personality traits becomes wider. We need to stop assuming that gender gaps imply sexism. Without going in depth into the arguments made about different genders, the memo basically argues that progressives have been conditioned to assume all differences in the outcomes of people are due to race and misogyny, neglecting other factors. In this case, the memo argues that although misogyny plays a role in the perceived wage gap between men and women, biological and social factors largely contribute. Women tend to be more social and creative, leading to fields that may not pay as much money. An example being the early child education field is dominated by women. This is not because of sexism, this is because of choice, and there is nothing wrong with that. He argues that men, in large part due to social pressures, generally navigate to fields that garner higher social status, thus, prevalence of men is often higher in those fields. He explicitly states that he does not believe that women are any less capable, only that they don't choose fields like tech for biological and social reasons in general, and this explains why there are more men in the field of tech. Men's higher drive for status. We always ask why we don't see women in top leadership positions, but we never ask why we see so many men in these positions. These positions often require long, stressful hours that may not be worth it if you want a balanced and fulfilling life. Status is the primary metric that men are judged on, pushing many men into these higher-paying, less satisfying jobs for the status that they entail. Note, the same forces that lead men into high-pay, high-stress jobs in tech and leadership cause many men to take undesirable and dangerous jobs like coal mining, garbage collection, and firefighting, and suffer 93% of work-related deaths. Again, he demonstrates that men tend to choose to enter into dangerous fields where in general women do not. This is not to say some women don't, or that they are not capable. It is just a real-world example showing that men and women make different career choices, and there is nothing wrong with this as long as they have equal opportunity to make said choices. He would go on to point out that part of the reason for this is feminism has given women more choice than men. Women broke out of their traditional role of raising children at home and gained the option of working or staying home. This is great advancement in individual freedom and should be celebrated. However, men have not had the same success breaking out of their traditional, culturally expected role, and significant stigma still surrounds men who do not work to support their family. Again, this supports the theory that men have more social pressure to obtain status jobs, which is why there are more men in the tech field, as an example. The harm of Google's biases. I strongly believe in gender and racial diversity, and I think we should strive for more of that. However, to achieve a more equal gender and race representation, Google has created several discriminatory practices. An example he used of this is programs, mentoring, and classes only for people with a certain gender or race. These practices are based on false assumptions generated by our biases and can actually increase race and gender tensions. We're told by senior leadership that what we are doing is both the morally and economically correct thing to do, but without evidence, this is just veiled left ideology that can irreparably harm Google, or irreparably harm America. We see the same issue on our college campuses, where colleges have called for the implementation of quote-unquote safe spaces, which are actually spaces designed to prevent different viewpoints from being expressed, and of course, those are most often libertarian and conservative viewpoints. This is anti-intellectualism. This is regressivism rather than progressivism. Universities should force people of different perspectives to debate one another and attempt to understand the perspective of others rather than creating safe spaces and ideological bubbles which only divide the country. I hope it's clear that I'm not saying that diversity is bad, that Google or society is 100% fair, that we shouldn't try to correct the existing biases, or that minorities have the same experience as those in the majority. My larger point is that we have an intolerance for ideas and evidence that don't fit a certain ideology. I'm also not saying that we should restrict people to certain gender roles. I'm advocating for quite the opposite. Treat people as individuals, not just as a member of a group. This is tribalism. Demoralize diversity. As soon as we start to moralize an issue, we stop thinking about it in terms of cost and benefits, dismiss anyone that disagrees as immoral, and harshly punish those we see as villains to protect the quote-unquote victims. This false promotion that we are constantly bombarded with through the mainstream media, through social networking, through Hollywood, through the American education system, that one political ideology is morally superior to the other, promotes an environment on college campuses all over the country where people are denied the opportunity to speak by 18 to 22-year-olds who have been convinced that they know the world, they have a moral high ground, therefore they have a right to shut down the free speech of others. Again, anti-intellectualism, regressivism, not progressivism, rather than arguing out points of view with people who see the world differently. Examples of this include April 26, 2017, Ann Coulter forced to cancel her speech at Berkeley. UC Berkeley blocks Ben Shapiro event at university on September 14th. Shapiro vows to fight back. David Horowitz speech at the University of Berkeley has been canceled. And of course, the way these speeches are shut down are through the use of force. Now, again, it's not government force. What the government does, the corporate government, is they brainwash large masses of the youth into thinking that they have a moral superiority in their ideology. Thus, they're justified in being violent against the hateful people who don't agree with them. It's psychological warfare being waged against the people. And at the same time, the corporate media is bombarding the public that everything white is bad. White people are bad. And then they prop up no-ones like Richard Spencer, who is a white supremacist who had about 3,000 followers, and they propped him up as if he was leading a national movement. They put him on TV, they covered his rallies, and the media does all this to convince the masses that white people are evil as part of a divide and conquer strategy, and that's what you're seeing play out in the public right now. Stop alienating conservatives. Viewpoint diversity is arguably the most important type of diversity, and political orientation is one of the most fundamental and significant ways in which people view things differently. In highly progressive environments, conservatives are a minority that feel like they need to stay in the closet to avoid open hostility. We should empower those with different ideologies to be able to express themselves. Alienating conservatives is both non-inclusive and generally bad business because conservatives tend to be higher in consciousness, which is required for much of the drudgery and maintenance work characteristic of a mature company. Again, This environment described at Google is a microcosm of the United States of America. The entire corporate media, everything we see, is a progressive environment. So conservatives feel like they have to hide, and violence is constantly being promoted against conservatives, as we'll see here.
My heart was pounding, and there was a noise in my head, and then her face was just coming at me, and I was like, ah! Ouch, ow, ow. My fist had a mind of its own, because I didn't even know I was going to punch her until she was punched. Oh my god, I lost control, I am a monster. I would have paid money, cash money, like $1,000, worth every penny. It was beautiful. Okay, what happened? And we want details. And will someone page me, please, next time Pierce hulks out? I think it's funny, it won't be when she loses her job. I'm going to lose my job. You're not going to lose your job. She attacked you, kind of, right? Okay, you weren't there. You don't know. Oh, lady deserved it. She got bitch slapped. You know she deserved it. It doesn't matter. There's a right and a wrong way for us to conduct ourselves. You know what? Gray has a point. Next time, leave the thumb outside the fist when you clench. That way you avoid bone damage. See?
Okay, this lady's fine medically, no real injury, but she is seriously pissed enough for your head.
See? Oh, God. Is it true? Callie punched a homophobe? Pierce punched a homophobe. Ooh, unexpected. No. Yes.
Popular culture purposely promotes violence against people that you disagree with. I would be the first person to tell you that you should challenge someone who's homophobic in an intellectual way. This from the New York Times. Hollywood, an industry whose major players have been supportive of President Obama and his agenda, will be tapped. Plans are being discussed to pitch a reality television show about the trials and tribulations of families living without medical coverage. According to the Ogilvy Plan, that's a marketing agency, the exchange will also seek to have primetime television shows like Modern Family and Grey's Anatomy. As you can see, popular culture actually promotes people being violent against people they disagree with. This is done by design, and the quote-unquote progressives, who I would argue are regressive, have taken over popular culture. On top of them controlling everything from the news to Hollywood to TV shows, they also hire marketing firms to push whatever it is they want subconsciously into the minds of people, specifically young people. Let's go back to the Google diversity memo. Stop restricting programs and classes to certain genders or races. These discriminatory practices are both unfair and divisive. Instead, focus on some of the non-discriminatory practices I outlined. Divisive like college campuses having a day without white people. Again, this is a slap in the face to everything Martin Luther King Jr. stood for. This is promoting segregation, promoting people being divided by race, religion, sex, whatever it might be. This isn't progressive. It is regressive. It is designed to divide, and it is done on purpose. Focus on psychological safety, not just race, gender diversity. We should focus on psychological safety, which has shown positive effects and should, hopefully, not lead to unfair discrimination. We need psychological safety and shared values to gain the benefits of diversity. Having representative viewpoints is important for those designing and testing our products, but the benefits are less clear for those more removed. De-emphasize empathy. I've heard several calls for increased empathy on diversity issues. While I strongly support trying to understand how and why people think what they do, relying on effective empathy, feeling another's pain, causes us to focus on anecdotes, favor individuals similar to us, and harbors other irrational and dangerous biases. Being emotionally unengaged helps us better reason about the facts. This is why they attempt to divide us by race. Emotion. It's easy to manipulate people with emotions. So you divide people by race, and you hold them responsible for the actions of their ancestors, or people that weren't even their ancestors, but probably looked like them. It's a divide and conquer strategy done by the new fascists. Prioritize intention. Our focus on microaggressions and other unintentional transgressions increases our sensitivity, which is not universally positive. Sensitivity increases both our tendency to take offense and our self-censorship, leading to authoritarian policies. Speaking up without the fear of being harshly judged is central to psychological safety, but these practices can remove that safety by judging unintentional transgressions. Microaggression training incorrectly and dangerously equates speech with violence and isn't backed by evidence. Microaggressions, self-censorship. They want us to see race in everything. So they push microaggressions so that everything becomes about race and it consumes us, and everything that's wrong in the world must be due to race. And then they could point the finger and say, these people are evil, you should condemn them, these people are the reason for all your problems. It's a divide and conquer strategy. It pushes politically correct behavior, where people self-censor, afraid to call the government out because they'll be labeled as a racist or a bigot simply for speaking a truth that has nothing to do with race or bigotry. This is new fascism. This is the world we live in. Understand that our government operates through psychology. The nature of government control has changed. Niccolo Machiavelli, Edward Bernays. You have to read these books to understand history, because by understanding history, we can unite as a people. Because no matter who you are, if you're white, if you're black, if you're gay, you're straight, Hispanic, you're an American, and we should all stand together against the people who are actually trying to oppress us. And that is the new age fascist dictators. Because Google, Facebook, Twitter, Hollywood, the mainstream media own the politicians. They're all in the bank together. They're one and the same. They are the new fascists. So one last time. Fascism. A form of radical authoritarian nationalism, characterized by dictatorial powers, forcible suppression of opposition, and control of industry and commerce, that came to prominence in the early 20th century Europe. Support my media for as little as $1 a month and gain exclusive access at www.patreon.com.